Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome all those who join us on our heritage.org website and other television channels in the future. We would ask everyone here in-house if you'll make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It is always appreciated. We will post the program on the Heritage homepage, of course, for your future reference. And Internet viewers, either today during the program or at any time viewing it, are welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Introducing our special guest and hosting our program today is Stephen Bucci. Dr. Bucci is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He is well-versed in special operations and cybersecurity, as well as defense support to civil authorities. He served as military assistant to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld for 5.5 years. Upon retirement from the Army, he continued at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. Immediately prior to joining us here at Heritage, he was a lead consultant at IBM on cybersecurity policy. He is also an adjunct professor of leadership at George Mason University and an associate professor of terrorism studies and cybersecurity policy at Long Island University. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Steve Bucci. Steve?
Now, let me add my welcome to Heritage. This is a rare honor for me. I get to do these things all the time, but I don't often get to do them with someone I admire as much as the speaker you're going to hear in just a minute. As John mentioned, I did work for Secretary Rumsfeld for 5.5 years at the Pentagon. I had 1 6-month break during that 5.5 years where I went to Iraq with a bunch of colonels to try and help out. And one of the things I got to do with my boss, who at the time was the deputy administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority, was to do multiple trips out to a little town called Fallujah, where our speaker was busily engaged in what's now known as the First Battle of Fallujah, as we negotiated with the town leaders to try and bring that to a conclusion. I could introduce the first speaker very quickly for all of you with a Marine Corps background by just saying that General James T. Conway served as the 34th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Full stop, you'd be satisfied, that'd be the end of it. But for the rest of us, I'll give you a little more information on him. General Conway, in addition to being one of the nicest men that's ever worn 4 stars, he really is. I can't say that about everybody who's worn 4 stars. I'm an old colonel, so it was a tough life sometimes. General Conway commanded a battalion during Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. He was the commander of the Marine Corps Basic School, where they train all their brand new officers. He was the president of the Marine Corps University down at Quantico. He was the commander of the 1st Marine Division. And relevant to us here today, as a lieutenant general, he was also commanded the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, 1st MEF, and did that for 2 combat tours in Iraq. He came back from Iraq to join the Joint Staff as the J3, the Senior Operations Officer in the United States military, and he went on from there to take that very, very specific and important job as the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And I'm gonna stop right there, other than the fact that he has a lovely, lovely bride. And the 2 of them, when the general was the commandant, she spent a lot of time together with him helping out Marine Corps families and wounded Marines that came back from both Iraq and Afghanistan. A wonderful, wonderful example of a husband and wife team serving the country. And by the way, that wife part of it, they don't get paid, and they work hours almost as long as their husbands. And she's a wonderful example of that special breed of lady. So with that, I will stop and I will turn this over to General Conway.
Well, thank you, folks, and thank you, Steve, for the very nice introduction. My mother would be delighted with that information. My mother-in-law would still be skeptical, but that's another story. Folks, I was invited to talk for as much as half an hour today, but in deference to some, I think, impressive panelists that we have on deck, and in an effort to just, I think, set the stage for what I hope is good interactive discussion for the time we have available, I'm gonna curtail that a little bit and just try to work through, if I can, some background and info that will hopefully set the stage for the discussion that follows. If I were to give a grade to our diplomatic and our military efforts in Iraq for OIF, it wouldn't be a high grade. Military probably a little better than diplomacy, but in fact we all seem like we continually learn lessons that you'd like to think that we might have known to begin with, and we could have avoided some trauma in the process. There were early indications as we attacked Baghdad that there were foreign fighters, read Al-Qaeda, I think, in the country. I had a call from my division commander, a gent named Jim Mattis, about 3 weeks into OIF. He was in a little place called Azizia, and he called back to my headquarters a few miles behind him and said, "General, I don't know who these guys are, but we've got about 300 fanatics here. We just killed the last squad charging a tank. And these guys are not Iraqi soldiers, they're not Fedayeen or Republican Guard." So he gave me another report an hour or so later, said, "Going through the pocket litter, these guys are from Jordan and Syria and Algeria, they're all over the Middle East." And so that was our first indication that foreign fighters, arguably Al-Qaeda, were starting to flock to Iraq to take up arms against American troops. You can question, the Iraqis are prideful people, and you can question them allowing people into the country and for purposes of fighting with them. But if you look at some of the things that occurred 03 and 04, I think you can see where particularly the Sunnis would welcome them, at least initially and from the outset. There were a number of what I would categorize, I guess, as missteps coming out of Baghdad that didn't help our situation at all in the Anbar province. The Baathists were told, "You no longer have a place in the government." Now we always were going to be concerned about the Baathists if they had blood on their hands, but there was a program in place to make sure that we kept those that served some utility and perhaps were low in the party. This order in a day put 50,000 people out of a position, and in a lot of cases brought mayhem to the country because they held some pretty critical positions as we started to restore Iraq. Not long after that, an order came out that said the Army is now disbanded. Well, okay, we had depended pretty greatly on the Army to be that most respected institution in Iraq that would help us tremendously to get the country back on its feet. I think it's fair today to call it the Egyptian model, based on what we've seen happen in Egypt and the critical importance of that institutional organization. Again, if this was an old Saddam general, he probably had no place. But for the lesser and those that had simply been a part of the Army and did what we asked them to do, we hated to see that dictate come down. The tribes were relegated to a lesser role than they had been under Saddam. And I'll say that was a lesson I think we all had to learn. If the military, at least the Marines, made two mistakes, I would say, one, we underestimated the importance of the tribes, and secondly, we did not fully appreciate the intensity of what a murder and intimidation campaign could do against the local civilians. Both of those things we had to come to appreciate really over time. Electrical power distribution was redone, and it did not benefit the Sunnis in the West, whereas previously they had been in pretty good shape in that regard as a limited amount of power was spread throughout the country. The Sunnis felt like they got the short end of that, and so commerce was made much more difficult. In fact, all of these things, in their minds, seemed to fall unevenly on a Sunni population in Anbar. You can add to that, from a military perspective, the fact that there were 3 or 4 incidents in about a 2.5-month period before the MEF returned for its second time that kind of made it tough sledding for us. There was what the Iraqis called the Fallujah massacre, where an army company occupied a school in the city, People protested. They wanted to open the school back up again. There was shooting, and 17 Iraqis were killed. Some 70 were wounded. A few days later, people protesting that event saw 3 people killed and again over a dozen wounded. And not long after that, there was an evening where, in a case I think of mistaken identity, 8 Iraqi policemen were killed. In those incidents, not a single soldier was wounded. So you start to get a feel for this sense of oppression, I think, that the people in Anbar province were experiencing. Remember our own history, the Boston Massacre, 5 Americans were killed. We're talking about it 2 centuries later. So you can start to get an appreciation for what Iraqis saw increasingly as an occupying force, not a liberating force. That was sort of the scenario we stepped into when the MEF arrived in March of 2004. We had a change of command with the 82nd Airborne. On 31 March, a scant 7 days later, 4 U.S. contractors were killed. And looking around the audience, I think most of you are old enough to remember sort of the incredulous feeling we all had when that took place. Our sense of incredulity centered around the fact that we asked the questions, who were those guys? Who sent them, and what were they doing in Fallujah? I mean, 4 white-skinned guys in a light-skinned vehicle could get killed in a lot of cities in Iraq, but especially in Fallujah. And we felt that their deaths were needless and pretty senseless had there been much better coordination. We started getting orders immediately to attack the city. And quite frankly, General Mattis and I both pushed back. I mean, we had come to Fallujah realizing it was going to be a very different place from what we had seen in the South, but also thinking that our efforts towards stability and security could work. It might take time, but it could work in that region. It certainly wasn't going to be facilitated by an immediate attack on a city of 450,000 people, and yet those were our orders. I checked with a friend of mine who was in a fairly significant position in Central Command and said, hey, is this coming out of Baghdad? He said, no, this is coming from up the chain of command. You do not have a chance of turning those orders around. And so then by about the 4th of April, we were in the attack on a city again of roughly 450,000 people without doing much in terms of intel prep, shaping operations, or removing the populations, or those types of things. If it was a mistake to start the attack, we would argue it was certainly a mistake to stop the attack. And those were our orders within about 10 days. Al Jazeera had 2 teams inside the city. I think the insurgents learned very quickly how to use the media. There was a report that kept coming out from a doctor at the hospital citing huge numbers of civilian casualties. He was a bigger insurgent than some of the leadership, but of course no one knew that at the time, and all this was being used very much against us. There were some civilian casualties. There had to be, because we had targets and we had not had a chance to clear the city like we should have done. And so we knew there were some casualties, but not nearly the degree that they were being highlighted in the media. And of course, bad things flowed from that. We stopped the attack. We began the negotiations that Steve talked about in a ring around the city. And I think coming out of it, there were probably a number of lessons learned. Hopefully, not least, is you should not make those kinds of decisions while emotions are still riding high, based upon what we had seen as the brutal death of those contractors. But secondly, once you make a decision, you got to follow through on it, because what it gave to the insurgents, one was, again, a powerful understanding of what the media could do. But secondly, the ability to say to the Middle East and other Muslim brothers, they had stopped the Americans in their tracks. And so the recruiting and all that would follow as a result of that were theirs to enjoy for several months, as was the safe haven that was created inside a city in the middle of our sector. So not much good came out of that first Battle of Fallujah that we could highlight and say was lending itself to accomplishment of the mission. Safe haven and sanctuaries existed. People, if you remember the people getting their heads lopped off and the attacks and so forth that were taking place throughout the region, we were fairly confident, those who were coming out of Fallujah, and so it had to be stopped. And after a time, the Iraqi government agreed with us, and then second Fallujah came to pass. Any concept that America would blink in the face of casualties was, I think, destroyed. We lost about 92 people in second Fallujah, unfortunately. There were, starting out, we think about 3,000 insurgents in the city. That number cut back to about 1,500 when the attack got into place in earnest. And some of those people, most of those people died at their posts. There were some surrenders on the 5th and 6th days, but for the most part, they were pretty fanatical, and they died in place as the Marines and the soldiers supporting them attacked the city. Again, coalition determination was demonstrated, and safe haven essentially went away. That then led us to another couple of years of fighting what was being called at that point the Long War. Throughout the rest of the region, Fallujah too had done some good things for us, but what it also had done is caused us to lose some initiative in the rest of the region. We had to pull battalions in, and in doing so, some of the people that had come to trust us and work with us suffered from that as people moved in behind us and started some summary execution and destruction of families and some of those types of things to make their point. Nevertheless, over those next couple of years, notwithstanding some unfortunate scenarios like the Abu Ghraib prison travesty, we were able to drive that wedge that we talked about from the very beginning between the Al-Qaeda, the extremists, and the population through building efforts, schools, a whole host of things that go with, again, security and stabilization operations. We were transitioning during that period to Iraqi forces. The 1st and 7th Division were assigned to Anbar, and we worked with them. And Iraqis started taking an increasing role in security ops. And the elections that came, well supported again by coalition forces, was seen as positively by the Iraqis. All of that, I think, created what we now call the awakening in the West. My view is that it started on the Syrian border with a group called the Desert Wolves, Iraqi tribesmen who were working with us to get rid of Al-Qaeda. They had simply overplayed their hand in time and had alienated in their own way the Sunni population against them. The surge followed, I think, the beginning of the efforts of the awakening. It certainly reinforced success in Anbar, but in the end, I think we all would agree that the combination of those things resulted in the defeat of Al-Qaeda. The Iraqi government, 2008 through 12, again, staying to the timeline, we saw an increasing emphasis on Shiite rights and responsibilities and privileges at the expense of the Sunni and the Kurd. And unfortunately, I don't think it can be said that the Iraqi government is even-handed in its approach to the three major distinctions that live in the country. We saw them get closer to the Iranians as the years went by. We saw, I think, some unlawful use of force, absolute massacres of some Iranian dissidents that were located in the country. I think some things that we'll never hear about in terms of eliminating opposition and things kind of behind the scenes that seem to hearken more towards the things we saw under Saddam than he would under a democratically elected Iraqi president. Nevertheless, those things did occur. And, of course, we were unable to work out the SOPA. I think that was partly the Iraqi government's responsibility, partly ours, for whatever combination of reasons it did a status of forces agreement so that coalition forces could stay on. In any event, it didn't happen, and we would not leave troops back if a SOFA is not in place. The topic of the discussion today is the implications of the Al-Qaeda resurgence, and I'll, in preparing for the panel, offer a few of my observations. I think the fact that you now have insurgents in Fallujah and Ramadi is not by chance. I mean, if they took over Qaim and Husayba, we would say, where are those places? We know where Ramadi and Fallujah are because we fought and died taking those cities. I think in being there, To whatever degree now, it causes Iraqi and U.S. policies to look a little weak and confused in the wake of how hard we fought to get those cities back in the first place. I think that the Iraqi economy was starting to recover. You were starting to get investment from foreign corporations. That's going to be stunted, to say the least, because no one's going to want to invest if you think that you're going to have terrorists next door. The possibility for a terrorist safe haven or sanctuary once again is with us. Whether or not that comes to pass remains to be seen, but if it happens in Iraq, it'll have much more resource at its disposal than it did even back in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, is a much poorer country. In some ways, the Al-Qaeda grand strategy is vindicated. If you go online to see what that grand strategy is, one of the first points is that we will be in this fight for as long as it takes. The infidels are impatient. If it takes 100 years for us, so be it. And so here we are now again, with them potentially having outweighted us to be in places where we had driven them from before. And, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but I think people who fought there, people who are trying to find the best of what we did can say, well, maybe one day a government that is elected, a representative government, as opposed to a dictatorship, will be an inspiration for what else happens in the Middle East. And I think that's somewhat called into question now. It may not be that model that we would hope for the rest of the countries involved in the Arab Spring. And again, that book is not yet fully written, but I think people are a little more pessimistic perhaps than they were before. It's certainly a source of frustration for us here in the States. I mean, anybody that looks at it now say again, insurgents, Al-Qaeda in Ramadi and Fallujah, that's where we were in the middle of 2004. And look at what it took in the interim to get those people rooted out and get Iraq to the point where we thought it was a few months ago. And not least, those who lost people, those wounded, I think are now stripped of a coping mechanism. If you have a young Marine or soldier sitting with his legs missing, he could at least previously say, well, what we did was the right thing. Iraq is better for it, and we won. I'm not sure that same individual sitting in that chair is thinking those things these days, and that's truly sad. Let me try to end on a positive note and say that the most recent information I have is that the tribes are once again responding. The tribes have been through this before. They know where that trail leads, and I have some level of hope, and maybe some of our other panelists can say more. I have some level of hope that the tribes will once again be the savior of that portion of Iraq. Okay. Sir.
All right, if the rest of the panel can come up. Please, sir. All right, I'm going to do this very quickly so we can get to the presentations and then to the Q&A, which I think is what most people would like to get to. We're going to have the speakers go in this order. Our first will be Jim Phillips, who is my colleague here at Heritage. He is our Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs. Jim has been with Heritage since 1978, always doing the Middle East. He is a former research fellow at the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress and a former Joint Doctrinal Research Fellow at the East-West Center. He'll be followed by Jessica Lewis. Jessica is the Research Director at the Institute for the Study of War. Jessica joined ISW in 2012 after 8 years as an active-duty U.S. Army intelligence officer. She deployed a total of 34 months collectively between Iraq and Afghanistan, and she's the lead analyst for ISW's Al-Qaeda in Iraq portfolio. So she is very well qualified to join us here. And Dr. Douglas Streusand is the Professor of International Relations at the Marine Corps Command and General Staff College at Quantico, Virginia, and an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics here in Washington. He has written several books and is an expert not only in the area but in the United States Marine Corps. So I think we've got the right panel once we put them together with the general to discuss the subject at hand, and we'll begin with Jim, When we do Q&A afterwards, I'll say this first so I can get right to the questions after they get done. The panelists are going to speak for approximately 10 minutes apiece, and then we've got microphones in the room. I will acknowledge you, identify yourself, and ask a question, please. No speeches from the floor. If I don't get a question mark at the end of the second sentence, I'll ask you to sit down. If you want to come here and give a presentation, see me afterwards, we'll arrange that. But today we want to hear and get as many questions answered by the panelists as possible. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Jim.
Well, thanks, Steve. I think General Conway has addressed the military context of what's been going on most recently in Fallujah relative to his experience in the first two battles. And I'd like to look at this third battle of Fallujah in terms of the regional and Iraqi political context. And it's clear that Fallujah today is the epicenter of a struggle for the future not only of Iraq but of the broader region, particularly what's going on in Syria. And this is not just a bipolar conflict between Al-Qaeda in Iraq or its successor, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. It's not just a bipolar conflict between ISIS and the Baghdad government, but it's a multipolar struggle in which there are other power centers, especially the tribes in Anbar province, also I think Sunni political leaders that have been squeezed out of power predominantly in recent years. And as General Conway mentioned, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was severely degraded and marginalized by an intensive counterterrorism program conducted by the U.S., its allies, and the Iraqi government between 2006 2011. But it's made a comeback now, partly, I think, for basically three reasons. One, it's been taking advantage of the absence of U.S. counterterrorism capabilities that left Iraq in 2011. But I think more immediately, it's been exploiting the mistakes of the current Iraqi government, and also tapping into the fears of the Sunni Arab minority that feels increasingly disenfranchised by a Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. It was not inevitable that Al-Qaeda would make a comeback, but it was predictable, and in fact, we at Heritage did predict that if the U.S. pulled out precipitously, then this would happen. Fallujah and Ramadi, two of the most important cities in Anbar province, which has always been a stronghold first of Saddam Hussein's regime, and then the broader Sunni insurgency against the U.S. and the Iraqi government. They have always been focal points for this struggle. In fact, nearly 1/3 of the 4,488 U.S. troops that died in Iraq perished in fighting in Anbar province. So it's no surprise that Al-Qaeda would try to come back here. Also, it's in close proximity to some of its strongholds across the border in Syria. And it said, nature abhors a vacuum, but Al-Qaeda loves a vacuum. It surged in strength on both sides of the Iraq-Syria border, in large part to fill vacuums of authority created by the dysfunctional politics in these two countries. In Iraq, the Sunni supremacist Al-Qaeda seeks to pose as the defender of Sunni Arabs against the Shia and what it contends as an Iranian-influenced government in Baghdad. In Syria, the two rival Al-Qaeda factions compete with other rebel factions and with each other to lead the struggle of the Sunni majority against the Assad regime, which is dominated by Alawites, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. Al-Qaeda's resurgence in Iraq has been bolstered by the spillover from the Syrian civil war, which has boosted sectarian divisions in Iraq. Al-Qaeda's comeback also reflects the mistakes of the Baghdad government, whose heavy-handed policies have alienated and provoked many Sunni Arabs, particularly in Anbar province. Prime Minister al-Maliki has consolidated power at the expense of Sunni moderates who have largely been squeezed out of power. And Baghdad also reneged on its promises to the awakening movement to support them. And I think that was the first line of defense against the return of Al-Qaeda, because as General Conway said, the tribes are extremely important, not just in western Iraq, but I think they're resurging in importance throughout the region. By ruling in an increasingly authoritarian and sectarian manner, Prime Minister Maliki helped to foster a polarized political atmosphere, and that pushed many Sunni Arabs into the arms of Al-Qaeda. Political violence is now surging to levels not seen in Iraq since 2008. The UN says that about 8,800 Iraqis were killed in terrorist attacks and counter-terrorist operations last year. And this has greatly benefited Al-Qaeda and its supporters. Al-Qaeda's comeback was also enabled by the neglect of the Obama administration, which greatly downplayed the security consequences of an abrupt pullout from Iraq. The administration was eager to pivot away from the Middle East ahead of the 2012 elections, and I think it declared prematurely an end to the war in Iraq. And as we've seen, there's been a lot of fighting since then. And those of you that have read about former Secretary of Defense Gates' book can see that inside the Obama administration, even at the highest levels, short-term political considerations too often trumped long-term security concerns. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, not only in the region, but in broader U.S. policy. The Obama administration also has made a bad situation worse through its disastrous Syria policy, which lagged far behind the conditions on the ground. The administration remains wedded to an illusory diplomatic solution, and essentially in which President Assad will negotiate the fall of his own regimes, and I don't think that's in the cards. Meanwhile, the failure of the administration to provide meaningful support to secular and moderate forces within Syria's fractured opposition has demoralized Western-leaning rebel factions and helped enable the rise of Al-Qaeda and other Islamist extremists inside Syria. But most importantly, I think the administration was disengaged in Iraq. Although President Obama promised to end the war in Iraq, we really just merely ended the U.S. participation in the fighting, leaving the Iraqis in essence to fend for themselves. And let's hope we don't see that in Afghanistan in the near future, because I think the results could be even more disastrous. The abrupt U.S. troop withdrawal in 2011 deprived the Iraqi government of important counterterrorism, intelligence, and training capabilities that were needed to keep the pressure on Al-Qaeda and allowed it to regain strength. Now the U.S. is confronted with the adverse security consequences of this abdication of responsibility. I think Washington and Baghdad share a common interest in defeating ISIS. The leader of the Al-Qaeda franchise threatened to launch attacks against Americans in the heart of your land in July 2012, and that's something that we shouldn't ignore. Yet after Al-Qaeda seized Fallujah, Secretary of State Kerry asserted that this is a fight that belongs to Iraqis. Although he went on to say that we're going to help them in this fight, I think the first thing he could do is start off by recognizing that the fight against Al-Qaeda is not just an Iraqi fight. This is also America's fight, and I think we need to get more engaged in helping Iraqis fight that battle. While no one's calling for the deployment of U.S. troops, but Washington could do much more to boost Iraqi counterterrorism capabilities. Iraq has sought to buy U.S.-made weapons such as Apache helicopters, drones, and other military equipment. And on Monday, the Pentagon announced the sale of 24 Apache helicopters, as well as 480 Hellfire missiles. That's an important signal that reassuring Baghdad that the U.S. can again become a reliable ally. And Washington should agree to expedite the delivery of arms already sold to Baghdad wherever possible. But I think we need to be careful not to sell sensitive advanced technology items to Iraq, particularly armed drones, because those could be passed on to Iran by sympathetic Iraqi Shia officials. If Baghdad wants the deployment of armed drones, I think they should be kept under U.S. control to make sure that they're used very narrowly against Al-Qaeda and not against other subnational political movements inside Iraq. But, you know, defeating ISIS is not just a military proposition. Intelligence, I think, is key. You can use smart bombs, but you can't use them smartly unless you know how to precisely target them. And rather than focusing solely on military hardware, I think Washington also needs to reshape the mindset of Iraqi security officials by helping them recalibrate their counterterrorism strategy to take a more discriminating approach rather than a sledgehammer approach, which they've tended to take in the past. The political piece also is extremely important in any long-term counterterrorism strategy. Sunni Iraqi support for ISIS must be drained away, and that can only come if the Baghdad government reaches out to moderate Sunni leaders and gives the Sunni tribes and other forces a sense that they have a place inside a big tent in the Iraqi government. This requires Baghdad to make a genuine effort, and Washington should agree to bolster security cooperation with Iraq on condition that effort is made. President Obama also needs to signal to Iraqis that Washington remains committed to helping build a stable and pluralist democracy in Iraq, and is opposed to not only Sunni extremists but to Shia extremists, because both threaten that goal. In return for stepped-up U.S. support, the administration should press Baghdad to take a stronger action to halt Iranian arms sales, which are crossing Iraqi airspace and on the ground. Such arms transfers only prolong the fighting in Syria and strengthen the Assad regime, and by doing that, strengthening ISIS across the border in Syria. The bottom line is that the administration must pay more attention to what's going on in Iraq and stop looking at the conflict inside that country through the lens of domestic U.S. politics. And start seeing it in terms of a long-term U.S. security interests. Therefore, it must stop talking about ending a war, and as if that can be done, unilaterally, the enemy gets a vote, and start thinking about how to help Iraqis win this war. And let me just stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Jessica?
Excellent. I think the principal point I'd like to start by adding is that AQI is not resurgent only in Anbar in the Iraq front. In fact, I don't even think that's necessarily where they began to reconstitute. I've been tracking their actions, their attacks, and their military organization since we left. And I think what we really saw was a reconstitution that followed the path that we pushed them up to, from the north in Mosul back down the Hammer Bridge, Diyala, to Baghdad, and that what we're seeing on Anbar right now is really not the whole iceberg. We have mentioned that the Euphrates River Valley that crosses terrain from Iraq into Syria is a key connector now. I think that has particularly become so since Al-Raqqa, the first provincial capital to fall in Syria, became accessible to Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the end of March of 2013. This is just right before ISIS was announced, and I would suggest that's right about the time when a second front really opened up in Syria. Otherwise, we're looking at Al-Qaeda's reconstitution in Iraq, and not exclusively in Anbar. I also think that the situation in Anbar escalated March, April, and May as we had the Abu Ghraib prison attack, which released another 500 prisoners, a number of whom are veteran, hardcore Al-Qaeda leaders. So as we understand what has allowed the conditions in Anbar to escalate, as having really grown during that period in the spring last year, we need to understand two things. First, that of course it's virulent, of course it's very strong, and of course they want to go after Ramadi and Fallujah for exactly the reasons that the general mentioned. And second, that that is not the first thing that they did. And they have multiple centers of gravity in Iraq right now too. So as we start to frame what it is, that military aid to the Maliki government, which has drawn forces from multiple provinces in Iraq to reinforce in Anbar, is capable of doing to destroy Al-Qaeda there, we need to understand what other fronts inside of Iraq they have therefore left vulnerable. And why would Al-Qaeda right now decide to move into Ramadi and Fallujah if they have strength other places? My concern is that right now they have the capacity and the increased opportunity to launch attacks on other fronts in Iraq. And that I am worried that the Maliki government does not have a comparable plan for how to engage those security threats while they are focusing upon operations in Anbar, and I'm concerned that we are focused there too. The places where I think that we have indicators that AQI is doing exactly that are in the upper Diyala River Valley, Muqtadiya, to Baghdad, Orchards. I've been assessing that they have been concentrated there and have safe haven there and are establishing control there for over a year. Last summer we started to see some fairly strong indicators that they were in control of Muqtadiya, to include population displacement, to include bombings of mosques. So we should expect that that is not a situation that if it is quiet right now, is quiet because there's nothing wrong. Similarly, I'm very concerned that the situation in Mosul has become dark because media have been targeted in order to keep that situation opaque. And I think that it is likely that AQI is not the only organization that is trying to establish control of that northern major city. So as we look at Iraq on a map right now, we've got Anbar, and there we've got Fallujah and Ramadi. We also need to be concerned about Mosul. We also need to be concerned about the extensive safe haven that is available to AQI in southern Nineveh, right at that crossroads where Kirkuk and Salahuddin and Nineveh meet, which is very hard to cover for security purposes. The Hammond Ridge and the upper Diyala River Valley as serious concentrations of Al-Qaeda. We also need to remember that the VBID campaign, the Vehicle-Borne Improvised Explosive Devices, the really big car bombs, that campaign has been ongoing for over 18 months. And in February last year, almost a year ago, it became uniformly focused upon Baghdad. So Baghdad has also been an attack zone for a year. So the implications of what Al-Qaeda is capable of doing to Iraq while this battle is ongoing needs to shape our expectations and our policy choices as well. Now, we've made reference to the political situation in Iraq, and I really do want to reinforce that just over this same time period, there has been a national protest movement, primarily among the Sunni communities, particularly in Kirkuk, Salahuddin, and Nineveh, where Anbar, I would argue, is not the center of gravity, the only center of gravity for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It is the center of gravity of the protest movement. So as we have security forces that are perceived by the tribes in Nineveh descending upon the two capital cities where that protest movement has been meeting for a year, we do have a situation that could become very explosive for a whole another reason besides Al-Qaeda, which I think has also factored into Al-Qaeda's plan in moving on to those cities right now. Ramadi and Fallujah are two very different dynamics. The tribes in Ramadi are working with the security forces. The Sahwa are mobilized with the ISF to fight Al-Qaeda. The tribes in Fallujah are not working with the Iraqi army. They are mobilizing as an anti-government force. It's not necessarily pro-Al-Qaeda, but is virulently anti-Maliki. We also see military councils being appointed by members of the protest movement, most likely, very likely also precursors to mobilization of Sunnis who are anti-government in multiple provinces, not just in Nineveh. So we do need to be concerned right now about the implications of the security forces moving upon the sites where the protest movement has been active for a year, and concerning ourselves with the possibility, the very real possibility of a Sunni insurgency in Iraq right now, and what opportunity that will lend to Al-Qaeda. So as we peel this back to our policy space and our policy choices, providing military aid to security forces on the ground, I agree is very necessary in order to counter a shared threat that is posed by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Right now, I see that that aid is vulnerable to the exacerbation of our vulnerability to a Sunni insurgency. And I'm afraid that our messaging to Maliki about the fact that the political divide with the Sunni is perilous is not getting enough traction. So I think we need to dig deeper on that front in order to make sure that a Sunni insurgency is a mitigated threat. Otherwise, I think we're going to see that anything we would do to try to counter Al-Qaeda in Iraq is going to be neutralized. Something that was posted on the Office of the Prime Minister's website was a Maliki quote that I would like to share as a response to our proposal that working more closely and providing political opportunities for pluralism and mitigating the threat of a Sunni uprising is necessary. Maliki said the ISF should avoid civilian casualties in Anbar. But he also expressed that such precautions will slow the resolution of the military conflict. I think that he is not framing that threat the way that we would, and I think that framing is necessary for our political and policy craftsmanship. Final thing that I would add is that the 2012-2013 Al-Qaeda in Iraq campaign was, as mentioned, focused upon exacerbating sectarian tensions. The Baghdad VBID campaign has been and continues to be focused upon Shia neighborhoods. It is remarkable to me that we haven't seen a more aggressive Shia militia mobilization in Iraq than we have, although the indicators are absolutely there. Those militias are mobilized in Damascus in Syria, and we should be expecting that there is a threshold that is based either upon Al-Qaeda's continued attacks upon those neighborhoods in Baghdad, Al-Qaeda's attacks upon spectacular targets like Shia mosques in Karbala or the Al-Askari Mosque, or a perceived threat of a Sunni uprising can cause a Shia response in Iraq as well, and that all of this is potentially mitigated as a threat by April 2014 elections. I expect Maliki will look to craft conditions for elections so that he can run for a third term. So there is also an opportunity to express in a policy space that is perhaps the most dangerous course of action for Iraq at this time. And I would recommend that we consider a range of topics to broach with Maliki right now in order to mitigate the Al-Qaeda in Iraq threat, that also consider his political ambitions for 2014. The final element that I would add into the equation, as the General mentioned, is the Ba'athist threat. I am concerned about JRTN specifically, Jaish al-Tariq al-Naqshbandiya, and its influence upon the protest movement, its influence upon this mobilization that we're seeing, and what opportunities they also have to capitalize upon the changing security situation in Anbar right now. So peeling all of that back to my principal portfolio, which is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I see all of these things as increasing their opportunity. And I think the principal concern that I have is that not just Anbar, look other places too, particularly Mosul, Diyala, and Baghdad at this time, because they have more opportunity while we're all focused in Anbar. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug?
Thank you. I'd like to thank Steve and Jim and the Heritage Foundation for the opportunity to speak here, and also to say to all of you that you don't understand what a privilege it was to work for the Marine Corps when General Conway was Commandant, and it was a privilege. Thank you, sir. If I had planned to talk about either American policy, options in Iraq, or the situation in Iraq in detail, I would have very little left to say because of the professionalism of my colleagues, but fortunately I didn't plan to talk about that. I'm a historian. I began studying Islam and politics not only before the 9/11 attacks, but before the Iranian Revolution. And what I can offer is historical context for the threat that we face and insight, I hope, into the nature of the struggle. And one of the most remarkable things about this conflict is that now, 20 years after the first World Trade Center attack, the 1993 attack, there's still a great deal of disagreement and uncertainty about the nature of our adversary, about whom we are fighting and why they're fighting us. And so I would argue that our enemy is an ideology and a network of networks. I refer to the ideology as totalitarian Islamism and define it as an amalgam of the persistent, dissident tradition of political action in the name of Islam that has existed throughout Islamic history, which I would say, as a historian, I would define as a persistent weak force, and Western totalitarian ideologies, and that the amalgam was developed, most importantly, by three names which ought to be familiar to all of you, and I fear that they might not be. Sayyid Qutb of Egypt, Abu al-Maududi of Pakistan, and Ruhollah Khomeini, known as the Ayatollah Khomeini. That the Sunni variety of this ideology seeks to bring about a utopian situation on earth through what they define as the reestablishment and global extension of the caliphate. But what that would mean, of course, is the establishment of a global totalitarian empire governed in accord with their interpretation of the Sharia, which differs significantly from that of the historical Muslim mainstream. And it would not be a restoration of the historical caliphate, which they do not understand, and that it would be the establishment of a new utopia, and of course any attempt to establish utopia produces dystopia, identified with a mythic past, and that there is a parallel with Marxism that may help some of you follow this, that the communism that was supposed to be the end of history in Marxist theory was supposed to be a return to the communism, primitive communism with which human history supposedly began before the beginning of the division of labor. Like other utopian ideologies, totalitarian Islamism combines a belief in the inevitability of victory with a belief in the personal obligation to take part in bringing it about. And going back to the sort of the ultimate founder of Islamic political response to the challenge of the West, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, It's a belief that by returning to true Islam, Muslims will regain what they saw as their historical global superiority. This ideology differs significantly from the historical mainstream Muslim approach to politics, and it is, because of the influence of Western totalitarian thought, something more than radical or extremist Islam. That is not, in my judgment, an accurate description of it. This ideology has failed to create a mass movement, but has led to the formation of a number of organizations linked together in transnational networks, or perhaps in a network with multiple nodes that both cooperate and compete. And the historical Al-Qaeda core, is only one node out of many, though it is an extraordinarily important node. So the term that I use for the adversary in general is the totalitarian Islamist network. Defining the enemy simply as Al-Qaeda is too narrow, and calling the network Al-Qaeda without qualification is misleading and imprecise. So when I think the vocabulary needs to change to some degree, and if we're talking about all of the parallel organizations using the Al-Qaeda brand, I would use a term like the Al-Qaeda networks, simply the Al-Qaedas, or in the difficult but charming Arabic broken plural, Al-Qawaid, the Al-Qaedas, and would argue strongly for never using the term Al-Qaeda without a defining adjective. That does not in any way imply that I regard the various entities as separate and unconnected, but I believe that it is, again, in Cold War terms, at least as unhelpful to fail to distinguish between them as to fail to distinguish between the KGB and the GRU. So I would speak of the Al-Qaeda core, or even the original Al-Qaeda, and then always use the affiliates names when I'm speaking of the affiliates. There's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Group Maghreb in North Africa and West Africa, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. There. And I would make this argument in part because Al-Qaeda Central, or Al-Qaeda Core, has neither ideological nor operational nor financial control of the affiliates, though it has ideological, operational, and financial connections to them. But if we were to be able to, unleash MARSOC, the Marine Corps Special Operations, and destroy Al-Qaeda core completely, it would be a great victory, but it would not end the conflict in any way, shape, or form. The affiliates are capable of carrying on without the core, and they are capable of operations beyond their regional bases. The totalitarian Islamist network has been called a global insurgency. I don't like the precise definition of equating it to that, but it certainly is insurgency-like. One of the things as an insurgency that it tries to do is to deprive incumbent governments and control of territory, and then establish its own control. In this case, it seeks to gain control of territories, not only as operational havens, but also as the nuclei of the empire that they wish to create. as David Gordonston Ross has argued, they believe, I think basically wrongly, but they believe that by continually imposing costs on the Western economies, particularly the American economy, they can prevail over us by the death of 1,000 cuts, so that one of the dimensions of the activity in Iraq has to do with keeping Iraqi oil off the world market and raising oil prices, although what's going on in North Dakota may make that difficult. And as the general said, they believe that their strength is in persistence and fortitude. They think that we are suffer from a civilizational attention deficit disorder, and that they can remain focused on the situation and will prevail, because we will ultimately leave and they will always still be there. I would point out that although they recruit some individuals through the appeal of the ideology itself, in many cases, I would say the majority, individual Muslims turn to totalitarian Islamism because they see it as a way out of a dilemma that it's not a product of the ideology itself. So that Hamas, a totalitarian Islamist organization, which is not part of the Al-Qaeda networks, recruits in great part by promising to satisfy the agenda of Palestinian nationalism. It uses Palestinian nationalism as a tool to make totalitarian Islamists. Similarly, the grievances of the Iraqi Sunnis, which are quite real, are a potent recruiting tool for the Al-Qaedas in general, and certainly Al-Qaeda in Iraq specifically. And I would add one thing to what Jim Phillips said about American policy and its relation to what's happening now, is that our rapprochement with Iran has given Sunnis throughout the Arab world grave concern about whether they can rely on the security guarantees that have been the basis of their national security policy, and have been looking to all kinds of options. You know, when even Jordan is talking about the desirability of nuclear capability, we know that there is a serious crisis of confidence in the United States among countries which have been certainly reliable clients and generally reliable allies. So in terms of the long war, or whatever we want to call this conflict, events in Iraq have the potential to be extremely serious. A haven in Iraq would be of far greater value to the Al-Qaeda networks than the havens in Somalia or the Sudan or Afghanistan, both because of its historical significance in the history of Islamic history, and because of the resources potentially available to them. So this has happened on the watch of the current administration, and the current administration has yet, in my judgment, demonstrated that it has either the will or the capacity to deal with it. And I need to guess, after having said that, I need to say again that I'm not speaking in any official capacity. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right, please, if you have a question, raise your hand. We have our microphones. All right, we have a gentleman right down here in the front.
Thank you very much, Abbas Kadhim with the Iraqi Embassy. First, thank you, General, for your service in Iraq. When you were fighting there, I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, being a professor there, and I got to know closely the good work you've done. So thank you very much. My question is to Dr. Phillips. What you said is said by many people about the power sharing, and it is really, of course, in theory, a good concept. But let me get back to you with the real politic of Iraq. When you talk about sharing power, I mean, we have a constitution, we have an electoral law, and we have also lists that are competing and winning numbers of seats, and they share the positions. Now, how much power sharing should Maliki, you think, give to, and given right now for every position that is occupied by one Shia, there are two Sunnis around it, either number 1, 2, 3, or 2 or 3, or 3 and 1. So how much can he do and still continue to hold his coalition together? Let's remember that Al-Iraqiyya lost about 11 or 12 seats because of these people were not given certain positions. Maliki holds right now 1 or 2 ministries right now for his party, and the rest is given to others. Now, how much can he take from his coalition, from the other parties that are with him, and give to the Sunnis out of the constitution and out of the equation of the results of the elections, and still we can say he can hold government and he is quote unquote fair to the Sunnis, given how much they already have right now, the speakers of the parliament, the number of ministries, etc. So have you considered that, and what do you think is fair? Thank you very much. And also, if the panel can talk a little bit more about the arming of the Iraqi military, because I think for a panel like this, this is a very major issue that I hope that you address a little bit more than just a couple of comments. And it's an excellent panel. We appreciate your comments, really. Thank you.
I take your point. I think there is a premium put in Iraqi politics for, especially for Prime Minister Maliki, who's competing more with other, his political party's competing with other predominantly Shia political parties, and so he can't show too much bending over backwards because he has to address Shia concerns, and the Shia have been, mistreated for centuries inside Iraq, and that sense of grievance, I think, is a limiting factor that politically restricts him from reaching out too much. But I think even with that, it was a mistake to have gone after his vice president, Tariq Hashemi, so quickly after the U.S. Drew, and I think that was a bad signal, and also the failure to follow through and paying for the awakening forces. I think that was a big mistake that created a vacuum that Al-Qaeda was able to fill. But it's, I wouldn't blame everything on Prime Minister Maliki, because I think he's responding in part to the political system as it's been created, and he's walking a tightrope. But I just think in the long run, he needs to think more as a statesman leading all of Iraq, and less as a sectarian politician, despite the fact that the political system gives him incentives to play sectarian cards in advance of the elections. And I think he can be part of the solution, and he does. I think he is interested in the long-term interests of the country as a whole, but he needs to, fend off some of the Iranian influences and maintain an independent path. And this, they say this, every crisis is an opportunity. Perhaps this crisis is an opportunity for him to shift his course and display that statesmanship. I hope so, for the long-run interests of Iraq.
Okay. Back in right there.
Hi. Thanks for coming out, everyone. So my question has to do with the Shia side of the equation in Iraq. So during the U.S.-led occupation of Iraq, you heard a lot about Muqtada al-Sadr and the Sadr militia, and it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that his influence has waned over the years. But what is the influence of Muqtada al-Sadr right now? And are you afraid of a full resurgence of his militia should Al-Qaeda continue to expand its operations in Iraq? And should the Sunni insurgency begin again?
Well, we defer to.
I see Muqtada al-Sadr operating primarily in a political sphere right now. The militia to which I refer and am most closely watching for indicators of mobilization is an offshoot that is no longer responsive to him, Isaib al-Haq. So I do think that there is a vacuum of security in Baghdad right now that is going to cause several different parties to step up to the plate as defenders of local communities. I see that very likely to happen in Sadr City, and I think that there will be multiple contenders for that role, and that there will be competition among Shia militias to include Sadrist elements and to include Isaib al-Haq. I see the two of them facing off most. So I would frame that as two very different things to watch. One is competition among Shia political entities leading up to elections, and another is who decides and who succeeds in becoming a champion for the communities that have been targeted in Baghdad.
Okay, I'm going to ask the next one, though I'm going to change it because I had originally said is AQ, and in deference to Doug, I'm going to correct it to are the AQs more dangerous today than AQ was on 9/11 or perhaps in 2008. So bring it to look at the across the world. So I guess for Doug and Jennifer. Or Jessica, excuse me. Jessica.
I would say that so far as I know, they are less dangerous, but that they are still dangerous enough, or which meaning far too dangerous for the interests of the civilized world, I guess. That they're certainly the capabilities, particularly of Al-Qaeda Central, to some extent of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, have been degraded. But they are not succeeding in mounting operations against the homeland or our allies only because of continuous vigilance, not because of a lack of capability to operate. So the threat remains.
Okay. Just you got something.
Al-Qaeda in Iraq is operating on three fronts: in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. I think we can frame the current threat a few ways that are important to capture. One, that I would describe their attacks in Iraq as incredibly well organized, part of considerate phased campaigns, military campaigns, and I regard this organization now as having capacity as a military structure, not just as a terrorist network. That it is durable, that they have stable funding streams such that their attack trends are decided not upon their resources but upon their design. And from that core, they branched out into operations in Syria and further into Lebanon. So in terms of how strong that organization is relative to a CT strategy, I see them as being stronger now, whereas before we were framing that in the context of boots on the ground operations. I also see that the organization in Iraq is writing its own core strategy, with respect to creating ISIS, which they describe with a map, annotated at the bottom as breaking down Sykes-Picot as Syria and Iraq with a big ISI flag on top of it. And they framed that in the context of a broader Al-Qaeda caliphate that looks shockingly like the Abbasid Caliphate. So I would attribute that to one franchise, to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but that they frame their vision in the context of a global Al-Qaeda vision, exactly the way that we've described multiple Al-Qaedas to do. So I think it is an interesting question, and I can only really speak well for this franchise, what it means for the broader Al-Qaeda network that one franchise is doing so well. Well, one of the ways in which that very concretely affects states outside of the region is that the Syrian conflict, the Syrian front in particular, has become a magnet for foreign fighters, and it has been now for years, and that these foreign fighters are learning tradecraft that was formulated originally in Iraq, and that they are inclined to export it. So I would frame that as a rising threat.
As we saw, after all, with the original Al-Qaeda and the so-called Afghan Arabs exporting their skills, the skills learned fighting the Soviets. But if another way of just the situation is that I disagree that the world changed on 9/11. On 9/11, we were forced to realize that it had changed, and that we have realized that it had changed strengthens us and weakens our adversaries. But it is always difficult to maintain vigilance without new emergencies to drive it.
John?
Steve, it's a great question, and frankly, I'm torn between some conflicting beliefs. You know, part of their grand strategy was also to use oil as a weapon against Western democracies. And our recent successes with our own sustained oil production, I think, make us less vulnerable. I think to a degree the world is less vulnerable. But at the same time, I think you could argue that Western nations have in some ways had their best shot against Al-Qaeda. And we have not eliminated the threat. I can't say whether the European nations or others in the coalition are as war-weary as we are, but I suspect they are. And so I think that leaves a more open field for them than we might like. I think that as a result of conflict, they have morphed and developed techniques and procedures that in some ways make them more effective. And I think the bottom line is, so long as you have developing countries with large numbers and high percentages of young men without work, there's always going to be somewhat of an attraction there and a breeding ground, if you will. So I think in some ways they may not represent as direct a threat to us in the United States because we've learned some lessons too. But I think in terms of the nature of the entirety of the movement as a threat to the world, I think it's still very powerful.
Okay. I have one, I'm sorry, that came in over the internet, so I have to ask it, and it's for the general. So it's sort of future-looking. It says, based on our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, do you believe non-lethal weapons will have a useful role to play in the future counterterrorism and regional security operations?
Well, regional security operations, yes. I think if you're looking at security and stabilization, again, getting back to trying to avoid civilian population injuries and death, non-lethals are really key in an environment like that. If you're talking counterterrorism, where you're actually going after the bad guy, I think, no, that your non-lethals are not what you're looking for. It's
Okay.
a mixed answer.
All right, all the way in the back, right in front of the camera.
Lokman Faili, Iraqi ambassador. Thank you very much for a very informative discussion. I have a small observation, which is to do with, and it's a question, the observation is to do with the drawing of the well regarding the funds. One of the panelists said that they're not short of money. I think it's an area which needs to be really looked at. I haven't seen a lot of research or discussion regarding the funding of the Al-Qaeda in the region. I think that's a lot of homework to do there. As to the question, how do you see the relationship with Iran, American relationship with Iran, evolving in relation to Al-Qaeda and in the whole region? Will that strengthen Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, or will that become more a forceful element by the combination of Iranian and American in that fight? How do you see that evolving? It's a general question. I don't know.
Thank you, sir.
I would just say, I haven't drunk the Kool-Aid about the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran on the nuclear issue spilling over into a true rapprochement, because I think Iran remains a revolutionary state, and even if there is a successful negotiation of the nuclear issue, which I think is very unlikely, that the U.S. and Iran will remain enemies. And I think partly because the legitimacy of the Iranian regime itself is based on unceasing hostility to the U.S., to the great Satan, and that they see they've justified their role within Iran as the vanguard of leading the Islamic world against the U.S. So it would be very difficult for that leopard to change its spots, but also, given the fact that Iran still has a strange relationship with Al-Qaeda and has facilitated Al-Qaeda, the movement of Al-Qaeda personnel through Iran from Afghanistan, including some of the 9/11 hijackers. You know, I don't think that the U.S. Is going to trust Iran to really crack down on Al-Qaeda. I think Iran sees Al-Qaeda as a useful club against Saudi Arabia, and I'd like to see more information coming out about Iran's relations with Al-Qaeda, and that was something called for by the 9/11 Commission. You know, particularly this 1996 Khobar Towers attack that killed Americans inside Saudi Arabia who were maintaining the no-fly zone over Iraq. That, to many people, looks like some kind of perhaps a joint operation between Al-Qaeda and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and I think a lot more needs to be looked at there.
I would say, I'll add only that when I use the term rapprochement with Iran, I should have put it in quotation marks, in that Jim Phillips said he hadn't drank the Kool-Aid. There isn't even any Kool-Aid in my house.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes, this question is for the General. General, I know you spent time in Afghanistan. Are you concerned about areas of Afghanistan falling back to the Taliban?
Well, to clarify, I didn't serve in Afghanistan. I visited there multiple times, of course, when I was commandant. But yes, I am concerned about what I would call the Afghanistan-Pakistan scenario. You know, in about 2009, Pakistan determined that their greatest national threat was no longer India, but it was Islamic extremists, especially in the mountains on their Afghan border. And they've been engaged. I mean, some would argue they would like to see more engagement, but they have been engaged, I think, against that threat for some time to come. My concern as the coalition in its totality starts to stand down from Afghanistan, it's the same question we saw in Iraq. Are the Afghan security forces ready? And might we see a situation where Afghanistan then is not the target, but Pakistan is, and that they will be the last man standing with that declaration of taking on the Islamic extremists as their number one threat. Afghanistan does not have nuclear weapons, Pakistan does. And so my concern for the long-term region, not just Afghanistan, is that threat really does need to be mitigated, to use Jessica's terms, lest we be faced with a very dire situation.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel. We've been treated to some insights into a subject that is historical, is a present-day issue, and is unfortunately clearly a continuing future issue that with which we need to deal. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your presence here.